Welcome back to the Female Dating Strategy, the meanest female-only podcast on the internet. I'm your host, Diana.
And I'm Rose, and I am overcome today with excitement and glee as we welcome our estimable guest, Dr. Jane Ward. Dr. Jane Ward, welcome.
Woo-hoo! Something about this podcast makes me want to cheer.
Yay! I have a cheerleader's love for wooing.
I think it's that I'm excited to be mean. I'm excited to be mean. Never an invitation for that.
You are invited to be as mean as you like. We encourage it out here. We didn't earn that reputation of being the meanest podcast for nothing. So go ahead.
Cathartic. And if there was ever a time to be mean, it's right now.
Thank you. I'm trying to get rid of my Minnesota nice. It's pretty hard, actually. It's pretty deeply bred in. But this podcast really does encourage me to let go of that and to embrace a bit of my, my snarky side. I think snark is probably the meanest Minnesotans can get. Like, you saw how, who is the vice presidential candidate? Tim Waltz. Tim Waltz. Like, even when Tim Waltz was, being mean, was he really that mean? No, because we can't be. But that's what this episode is about. It's like letting us really get to the heart and the sincerity of what's going on with heterosexuality. And before we get into that conversation, I'd just like to give a brief biography overview for our listeners. So Dr. Jane Ward, sit tight while I tell them all about your amazing background, okay? Here we go. Dr. Jane Ward is a powerhouse feminist scholar and author whose work drags the institution of heterosexuality into the spotlight and holds it accountable. As professor and chair of feminist studies at UC Santa Barbara, she unpacks how straight culture, whiteness, and gender norms are socially constructed to keep women compliant and men centered. Her award-winning book, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, challenges the assumption that straight relationships are the natural or superior path for women, instead exposing just how much emotional labor, self-abandonment, and gaslighting it often demands. Whether she's dissecting bro-on-bro sexuality in Not Gay or calling out the cult of compulsory heterosexuality, Dr. Ward's work is a masterclass in why opting out of male-centered romance isn't radical, it's survival. Diana wrote that. Isn't that wonderful?
Thank you. Thank you so much. But I have to say, feel free to be as mean as you want today, ladies, because you know what? The Pope is in charge. And Minnesota is on the map. Or wait, actually, where is he from? He's not from Minnesota, is he? He's
Chicago.
He's from Chicago. My bad. He's from Chicago. And we've got the Midwest out here representing us in the Holy Land. And maybe, that gives us license to be as mean as we want now. I mean, if the Pope says it's okay, I guess it's okay, right?
Right. It's an important corrective. I just want to say that hopefully this is on brand, that you may be hearing my chickens in the background, my hens.
Ooh.
We have only hens because, of course, we are eco-feminist lesbians with a little homestead back here. And so they're making sounds. I don't know if we can hear it, but yeah.
I can't hear them. But that does sound very on brand, and I like it. I love that for you.
Yeah, I love that you have what do you call a group of hens?
A brood?
A brood. I think it's a brood. I love that you are living among a brood of hens. Also, is the reason you can't have a rooster because of zoning laws?
Well, it happens to be the case that here where I live in Santa Barbara, you cannot have a rooster. But we've kept chickens for years, including when we lived in LA. And you can have as many of roosters as you want. But it turns out that roosters are rapists. They're just the worst. They're horrible. They're really horrible.
You mean they're not the provider and protector of hens? Because that's the narrative we see going around.
No, exactly. I mean, I've actually wrote a little blog about, using chicken gender relations as a metaphor for human gender relations, because there's so much overlap there, including that everybody thinks that hens need a rooster. But they don't, and they don't need a rooster to even produce eggs. And in fact, when there's no rooster, one of the hens kind of emerges. We call her Butch Hen. She sort of emerges as the mask leader of the group.
I have to say, I love how you use straightness and queerness also within the biological world. Like, Dr. Ward, you have such a wonderful sense of humor. I was rereading your book again, and I was just chuckling throughout. And I was like, wow, it's so refreshing to see an academic write with verve and zest. you're like from the sparkling champagne region of France. You're not you're not you're not the sparkling wine version. You are the champagne. It's so amazing to see how you do weave humor, with your critique. And I just wanted to ask, like, how did you decide that that was going to be your approach? Because, I come from an academic background myself, and like having my voice be hammered out from any and all academic writings was really difficult for me. And one of the reasons why I was like, maybe this isn't the path for me. And so I was just really impressed with reading your work, how you managed to keep your own voice while also still being scholarly. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to that path and how you decided you were going to stick to it?
Yes, and I was nodding while you were talking about your experience. I mean, I think it was about coming into my own voice, which I did not have through graduate school because, of course, that gets kind of trained out of you. And then even with my first book, I didn't feel like I could really speak in my own voice. But then after I had tenure, I was like, why would I not be myself in my writing? And humor is a big part of the way that I process and survive the world. I mean, I was also like raised on Saturday Night Live and The Simpsons. So this is just, how I move through the world. I actually, even a lot of like pretty crass, childish bathroom humor. But especially when we're talking about the pain of homophobia and transphobia. I mean, I think queer people, humor is making fun of straight people is one of our favorite pastimes.
There's just such rich fodder for you to make fun of.
There's so much there. Right. The jokes write themselves. They really do.
And that's why I was really happy to see that you had cited John Waters, who was really my first introduction, I think, would you call that queer cinema?
Mm-hmm.
Where he talks about, how sick and boring the straight life is. And I love that, like, it had a mix of both sick, so like this idea of wellness and of being profoundly unwell. That's one stunning indictment. But then boring was like the ultimate drag, right? Like, oh, burn. Not only are they sick, which is cause for concern, but they're boring, which is like a terminal condition, right?
Yes, and that actually was. So there's a chapter of Tragedy of Heterosexuality where it's incredibly scientific, where I basically just like interview 58 of my queer friends. And I'm like, tell me about your experience of straight culture. Sorry. Like, what does it feel like when you're around only straight people? What does it feel like to be in a straight space? And they said all sorts of things, but the number one most common thing that was said was boring. And, we tend to think of boring as like relatively low stakes, like, well, what's the harm of that? But the way that they talked about it was using the word boring, but also with an implication of something bigger than that, which is kind of like soul killing, stifling, like draining the life force out of you. And it makes sense because if you look at the way, one of the most common homophobic slurs that was used against queer people in the late 20th century. I mean, I don't know if you can even call it a slur, but it was like one of the things that straight people would say is like, why do gay people have to be so flamboyant? Why do gay people have to be so in your face? And so if you look actually at these two cultural experiences, and it makes me think a lot about some of the writing of the late, great, wonderful Jose Munoz, who's a queer scholar. There's a kind of emotional flatness in straight culture and a kind of emotional a sort of exuberance in queer culture. And I think people were really, they were trying to get at the way that any kind of norms that we have, heterosexual norms, sexist norms, gender binary norms, they flatten us. They're like containing and constraining us. And queer people feel that very palpably.
This chapter, you say, this chapter should be read as an ethnography of my own social and political milieu, reflecting my feminist queer social network and the kinds of conversations that happen within it, end quote. And I think that is something that, I was reading all of these. I love how you have, like, you just leave, like, this is from a femme wasp. This is from a queer Latinx male, right? And it was so eye-opening because, even if you are a straight person, as Diana and I are, who have friends of all kinds of stripes, like a lot of times, I'm sure this is a sort of commentary that's reserved for people who are queer or gay within their own circles. Like they're not coming to their straight friends and being like, it's tragic how boring your life is.
And I think there's another aspect of it that, you look at older portrayals of gay couples in general, it's always seen as something that's tragic. Like the popular narrative in media was always like, oh, this is a tragic way to live. And heterosexuality is presented as a very joyful way to live. But then you live in the real world and then you interact with heterosexual couples. And overwhelmingly, there seems to be some, I don't know, like a relishing of how bad it is. Like people commiserate based on how horrible it is. Like, people bond over how terrible it is to date and how terrible it is to be married and how terrible, the old ball and chain. And these narratives of like actually not liking heterosexuality that much, which is why, it's really interesting that the title of the book itself is The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, because I don't think it's really presented that way. And that there's so much performance that goes into attracting a mate, having a partner, being in a relationship, marrying them, that actually kills a lot of the joy of enjoying an intimate relationship. And the way that gay relationships are portrayed is like, oh, the entire existence of this relationship is something tragic. But when you actually explore it underneath the surface, it's actually really joyful. I mean, of course, it's got like shit just like the rest of us do. I mean, all of our, our shit stinks. Everybody's shit stinks. But I think that, there is this like natural knee jerk reaction to just showing heterosexual couples as like the norm and the aspiration for what most people should want. And I think that's what leaves a lot of people behind in feeling like, oh, I haven't really gotten there yet. And I think a lot of young women feel a lot of pressure to be like, I need to pair up, not so much because this relationship is adding value to my life, but because it's going to say something to society if I don't.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so much in what you just said. And, it's not just that heteronormativity kind of compels us or tracks us towards heterosexuality. It's that it also gaslights us in exactly the way that you just described, which is it promises us that heterosexuality is going to deliver happiness. And one of the ways that it does that is it says, well, you're definitely going to be happier relative to gay people because gay people live sad lives of discrimination, basically. But if you actually talk to queer people, especially if you talk to queer people who've spent any time thinking about this, what you often hear is profound gratitude to not be straight. Like, if anything, kind of pity and worry, concern about straight people. And one of the reasons that queer people feel that way is because so many of their interactions with straight people, primarily women, straight women, are centered on those people's complaints about their lives. And so it's very common for queer people to be like, do those straight people even like each other? Like, why do they keep going back for more? And so that's why the book is called The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, because, when you think about a classic tragedy, it's something bad that's happening, but it's also like you can't get out of it. You might even see it coming and there is no alternative. And it's that repetition of this with every generation, where every generation of women, has a whole slew of self-help books about like what's wrong with men and how do we fix this. And every generation of women has, some feminist hopefulness that things are going to get better. And every generation of women has their icon in a movie who like sets her cheating ex-husband's car on fire or whatever. It just happens over and over and over again. And I think now we're in a moment of really grappling with that because there was I think a feeling that, well, at least men are getting a little bit better with each generation. And then at least in the US, with all the data we have about how young men in particular voted, and then the rise of young men's participation in hyper misogynistic areas of the dark web, of the manosphere. I think that has been quite a wake up call for a lot of women. Like, we're actually not guaranteed progress here.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the growth of online misogynistic media like the Red Pill and, Andrew Tate and all of these other, the manosphere in general, do you think that there's like an example of that from the past? Like, do you think we're just repeating? Because I mean, one of the things I got from reading your book was just we're repeating the mistakes of the past and we can't even really see it because we're doing the same thing and expecting different results. And so, I don't know who said that, but somebody said that was insanity to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. But do you feel like we're actually regressing and going into new uncharted territory that's much worse in many ways?
Well, we couldn't probably get worse than where we have been because we have been in times in which women were by law property of their husbands. And most of human history has been a time of sanctioned patriarchal violence. And, women could be legally raped by husbands. So I wouldn't say we've gone back so far that we're in a time that's of unprecedented patriarchal oppression, but I definitely would say we're going backwards from where we have been in just the last 50 years. In some ways, the alt-right gender discourse reminds me of something that we saw in the 1950s and in the 1960s and 1970s when Playboy magazine became very popular. And so there have been a few scholars who've written about that whole culture of Playboy and, what was the ideology of that magazine. And it really was that, you know, men did not like their wives. That magazine was so popular because it just kind of acknowledged that men don't like their wives. They find the domestic space to be a site of like control and of their and diminishing their freedom. And so they want a space where they can really be men and connect with other men. And that means staring at young nude women younger than their wives, being able to read like super sexist jokes about how women are morons and stuff like that. And I think the manosphere does a kind of similar thing. One of the most common kind of it's sort of a meme, but it's also an argument or a logic. Maybe you could even say it's like one of the paradigms of the manosphere is that women have too much control, and that the kind of metaphor they use is the Iroquois longhouse. I don't know if you have followed tracks this.
I'm not familiar with that. Can you explain that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the Iroquois longhouse, it's a kind of structure that would be the communal gathering space in Iroquois community. And it's also where maybe there would be the hearth, women would be working, and these men on the kind of the intellectuals of the alt-right have used that as a metaphor to say that the den mother, the archetypal den mother of the longhouse, who sort of gathered the community and directed the community, has become our nation, that our nation has deferred to women's feelings, and we need to return to men's feelings. And the evidence that they give of this is that, they say that women's power is the soft power of shaming and canceling men, and that men need to respond with the hard power that they have, which is aggression and violence. And so, anyway, I could go on and on about the logic of all of this, but it's same. It's basically what men were also saying in the 60s, like, women are dominating me and I don't like it, and I don't like women, and I need to be set free.
Mm. But it's interesting you mentioned that, men don't like their wives, but men also choose their wives. So you would think that they would choose someone they could like.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that wives get older, and many men seem to not like that. They also have children, and many men don't want to do an equal part of the parenting labor. So we know that women initiate the vast majority of divorces. They initiate about 70% of divorces. And it's often around these very kinds of conflicts that, they liked each other when they first got married. And then the reality of a marriage, which is it's both a relationship and it's a side of labor. And so if only one of you is doing the majority of that labor, obviously that's people are going to be really resentful unless you romanticize it, which is what's happening with trad wives and stuff. But for most women, it's not romantic that your husband can't wash his own dish.
I guess not.
I actually thought you were going to say it's not romantic that he can't wash his own dick, which I also think is apropos.
Yeah, that's definitely not romantic. That's just gross.
Could I quote from your book, quoting Valerie Solanas?
Yeah. Yes, let's bring her in. We need her in this space.
We do. And I still remember the first time I read her and I was like, what? This is amazing. And then I read somebody say it was like, well, it was supposed to be satirical. And I was like, but was it though? Because I was feeling all the feels.
Yeah.
Is this from the Scum Manifesto?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And this is from the chapter on about heterosexuality being sick and boring. And I like how you bring up that things that bore us are not just uninteresting. You say, quote, to bore something is also to make a hole in it, to hollow something out. Hence, sometimes being bored feels like being completely empty. I'm going to continue this quote from your book. Significantly, Valerie Solanas began Scum Manifesto, her 1967 wild feminist screed against the patriarchy, by reminding readers that oppression and boredom are interconnected. Quote, life in this society being at best an utter bore, and no aspect of society being at all relevant to women, there remains to civic-minded, responsible, thrill-seeking females only to overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, institute complete automation, and destroy the male sex, end quote. And I love how you bring up that oppression is inextricably linked to boredom. This is something that I think gets overlooked, but I think this is basically like the playbook for fascism.
Yeah. I mean, what happens is that the people in power get to decide what we talk about, how we spend our time. They can make irrelevant everyone else's concerns. And so one of the experiences of that, I mean, I think there are a lot of emotional registers for that experience of being on the other end of that. One of them is boredom, that, you turn on the news and you have to listen to Donald Trump, and it's somehow both enraging and terribly boring at the same time. And in part because you realize, oh my God, all the other things we could be talking about, dreaming about, making happen, we don't get to do that.
Which is ironic considering that romance and heterosexuality is posited as the zenith of life's fulfillment. So basically, is it just one gigantic psyop at this point? Because that's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say psyop, because that actually comes up in another chapter of the book where this is the one ethnographic chapter, is that this time, so this wasn't the height of pickup artists. It was when I was writing this, it was after that. And after the pickup artists had gotten, really scrutinized and slammed for how sexist they were, they went through a period of kind of rebranding themselves as just dating coaches for men.
Self-help for men.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it was in that time that I reached out to them and I attended their trainings, their boot camps with 2 different companies. And even as they were in the middle of this nicer, friendlier, gentler pickup artist rebrand, they still were drawing on all sorts of data about exactly how many times you have to touch a woman and where in order to prepare her for your transitioning her into your car so you can take her home to fuck, this kind of stuff. And they do draw on FBI, a couple of FBI psyop studies about, the psychology of manipulation and so forth.
Based on you attending these sessions, do you have any advice for our audience on what to look out for with these kinds of men? Because I think that would be really helpful for what you observed, just because this sounds insane. I mean, there's just no other way to say it, is that there's no amount of times that you can touch someone. Like, I think they even call it like breaking the touch barrier or something. Cause I think, what was the pickup artist book? I think it was by some guy called Neil Strauss or something.
The game.
The game, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that was like the Bible for a lot of these men. And I don't think it's really evolved past that too much in terms of how they approach women with this kind of mechanical sort of script that's really easy to see if you're properly socialized. But I was just wondering, like, do you have any advice or anything that you thought might be helpful to our audience from what you've seen in those sessions to avoid these kinds of men?
I mean, I really hope most women are kind of alert to these tactics now, but in case they're not, I'll just say, the whole thing runs on the idea that you're trying to distinguish yourself from other men because it's a competitive game to get women into bed. So other men might be more attractive than you, they might have more money than you, and so you're going to use these like psychological strategies to give yourself the competitive edge. And they look like often using like self-deprecating humor that these coaches believe that kind of puts women at ease. So you might make jokes about like being gay, and that makes this woman feel like, okay, well, you're not a threatening creep. You're like a playful guy who's willing to make a joke about your own masculinity. They're instructed or taught by these coaches, like, try to align yourself with women in the bar against the creepy guy. Like maybe you point out that some guy, he seems too drunk or he's too aggressive or whatever. So you're building a kind of almost like pseudo feminist solidarity with her, so that then you can take her home and fuck her. I mean, they really are coming at this from every possible manipulative angle. I think most women in reality, they can trust their intuition and know that, when something is a manipulation. I guess what I want to say for straight women who are in bars engaging with these kind of dudes is like, there's no way to win other than just decide, why are you there and what do you want? Do you want to fuck a dude that you meet that night? Well, great. Then you pick him out and take him home. Because the whole thing runs on this idea that women are kind of gatekeeping themselves, and they're the prize and men are competing for the prize. And that's what, from a queer perspective, it's like, what? Like either you want to have sex or you don't. And if you do, then why aren't women leading this? So I would say, more than like recognizing what is a creepy line versus an authentic line, it's really about women having a more, I think, maybe a clearer and more agentic relationship to their own sexuality.
You mentioned in your email about how there's been a reaction to the alt-right and the manosphere from, hetero-pessimism and 4B. Rose and I had actually done an episode about 4B a while ago. I mean, I also saw something called boy sober. I think that's quite new to me. I don't think I've heard of that before, but I think they all kind of come under this blanket of women essentially checking out from heterosexual relationships. And I wonder, has there been a historical precedent for that as well? Or is this something that we're seeing that's a new reaction?
I actually think this is kind of more like a strike in a way. It's like a sex strike.
Like a illicit product kind of thing.
Well, a lot of people have compared it to political lesbianism, and I don't think it's really the same. It's more like a boycott. So, but it is interesting to compare the two. So in the 1970s, there was an understanding that patriarchy was the problem and lesbianism was the solution. And because not every woman was a lesbian, it was theorized that women could become political lesbians, which meant that they recognized that having sexual relationships, romantic relationships with men was kind of being complicit with the patriarchy. So they just would refrain from doing that and aligned themselves with a lesbian politics. But what was different about that is that I think a lot of the women who did that, I think, felt pressure to do it. It was kind of a movement rallying cry that women ultimately kind of gave into. And because many women, I think, felt some political pressure or guilt that made them do it, it ultimately, it was not successful and it caused a lot of bad feelings, I think. Whereas this 4B and heteropessimism and boy sober is really more about straight women themselves, not in any kind of conversation with lesbians, recognizing that the things that they were promised from heterosexuality are not being delivered, and that it might make sense to withhold that it might make sense to either take a break from sex with men or to use withholding of sex as a kind of bargaining chip in what is ultimately, a power-based conflict between straight men and women.
But I do think some people aren't just withholding sex. I think they're withholding any kind of relationship with men as well. Because the 4B women in Korea are definitely boycotting a lot of things that aren't just sex.
Yes, dating, marriage, they
I mean, some of them are boycotting the beauty industry. They're not watching misogynistic media. Like it's been pretty all encompassing in certain countries, I think.
I love it. I love it.
I do too. I am an absolute high alt with the fact that, women are beginning to sort of, I call it the gender unionization. I'm like, listen, lesbians have shown us the way for decades now, if not, centuries. And it's been on us for refusing to listen. So now that things have gotten to the point where like, oh, no, 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 this can't continue on. Like, why don't we look at what's been already established and laid out for alternative paths to future happiness? And this is why I love that you end your book, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, on deep heterosexuality, Dr. Ward. And I wanted us to introduce this. I think this is a concept this is to me like a fantastically academic concept that needs to become mainstream. So would you help now to help disseminate it to our listeners so they can start to understand and grapple with these questions you bring?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I hope it takes off. I really do. If I were a straight man, I would be really relieved to encounter this concept. Yeah, so, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that there's something weird, something kind of half-baked, something incomplete about the way that straight men love and desire women, because the way lesbians love and desire women is that when you're a lesbian, you're not just interested in the women you want to have sex with or date. You want what's best for all women. Your love of women is inseparable from your hope for girls and women to be free. And so that to me feels like something that does not need to be specific or unique to lesbians. It's something that I think men could cultivate. And it's something that straight men don't yet, I think, possess as a group of people. And so one of the questions I ask is it possible that straight men could love women, could like women so much that they actually like women? And anything short of that, I don't mean to like weaponize homophobia against straight men, but there's something a little bit gay about the way straight men seem to care more about what other men think than they do about women. And oftentimes, even their desire for women, their sexual relationships with women seems like it's more about impressing other men or winning at the game of heteromasculinity than it is actually about women. And this is so twisted, it's so contradictory that it's hard to even kind of wrap your head around it, but we actually have tremendous evidence of it. And one of those is that when men, especially young men, like even boys in high school, when they're too into their girlfriend, according to their friends, they get called a fag. If they care too much about women, if they watch films, if they watch a chick flick and enjoy it, anything that's kind of woman centric,
Then they're gay.
yeah, can actually mark a man as gay. What a twisted logic that is. Like, what if we actually said to straight men, look, show us the receipts. You're not fully straight unless you can show that you actually really are interested in women. I was having this conversation with someone the other day, I forget who it was. And she was like, yeah, we should say to straight men, like, name 5 women, name 5 women.
That's so funny because back in the day when I was on the dating apps, like this was a long time ago, one of the questions I had for men was name 5 women you respect that's not a member of your family.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And you'd be surprised how many of them struggled, okay?
Yeah. And then you want to just be like, you know what? I think maybe you're not straight. That doesn't sound very straight to me.
Fellas, is it gay to love your wife?
Right.
Exactly. Well, this reminds me too, Dr. Ward, of like, I'm somebody who comes from both the arts and like the literature. So it's full humanities, right? Representing right here. And one of the questions or one of the conversational pieces I would always steer dates towards was like, name me some women authors. Name me some women authors of color. Name me some queer authors. And same for musicians. And you know what? Not a single one of them could answer. They only ever listen to other men. And this is what I think you mean by saying,
Yeah, but some of them don't even read. I mean, let's talk about that. Like, and I don't think many of them are consuming literature anymore. Like, I haven't met a guy who reads books in a while now. Like, I think that in general, there's a lot of people who just don't want to read anymore.
I mean, yes, that's a whole other problem.
I do think it's somewhat relevant here because I think that not wanting to consume ideas from other people that have different opinions from you is part of the problem. I think part of the reason they go to these podcasts is because they're going to be validated by those men who feel exactly the way they do and think exactly the way they do. It is like a hive mindset. And they want to be validated in their hatred or their anger towards women, especially if they lack success with them. For me, in general, I always think it's a red flag if someone doesn't like to read or doesn't like to consume things that differ from their own opinion, because I'm like, why would you want to be in an echo chamber, you know?
and this is why I have to return to Dr. Ward's understanding of deep heterosexuality, because I think what really struck me in this book was, first of all, I like how you say, what if men could get to the point where liking women actually meant liking women, right? And one of the ways you frame it is you say, well, we could look at it as liking women, or we could look at it as a woman identified man. And can we go into what that means?
Yes, and thank you for bringing me back here because I didn't really answer about deep heterosexuality. So one of the things that I was grappling with is that the other queer writers who have addressed this problem or who've just written about straight culture and the dysfunction of straight culture in general have often concluded that we need to queer straight people, that the more straight people kind of engaged in queer ideas and practices, the better it would be. And I ultimately settled on a different position, which is that what if straight people and straight men in particular actually went deeper into heterosexuality and realized its like full potential, which is for straight men to actually deeply invest in women and identify with women. And so, in lesbian feminist, in the lesbian feminist canon, there's a lot of writing and reflecting on women identified women. And that idea was that, it's through loving another woman that in part you come to love yourself, and that there was a kind of feminist magic in a lesbian relationship because it wasn't just that you were loving another woman, but you were coming to really know what makes women lovable. But I think many of those impulses are actually something that men could benefit from, which is that the logic of heterosexuality has for so long been about how opposites attract, that like men and women might not actually like each other, they might not have much in common, they're from two different planets, but it's all that oppositeness and maybe even that conflict that keeps the spark alive. But I actually think that's just not true. That's why we have so much evidence that when men and women don't like each other, it actually doesn't make for a good relationship. And so, what would it look like for straight men and women to cultivate an actual respect of one another and interest in one another? Something grounded in identification rather than oppositeness. And it sounds so simple and obvious, but it actually requires that we reconfigure how we think about gender, even. because you can't have men and women strongly identify with each other if they're invested in the idea that men and women are fundamentally different kinds of people. And so people have to have a more fluid understanding of gender itself in order to really go there. So I think that's the work more than like if, more women would just like peg their husbands, all this would be resolved. Like I just don't think that's actually what we need.
I don't think it's where it's gonna go. And this is what I thought. Can I just do some more quoting from your book?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Before we get into the quote, I just wanted to make a little announcement.
Oh, please.
Yep. For all our listeners, we're so excited to have Dr. Jane Ward with us here today. And if you want to listen to the rest of this episode, please go to our bonus content. Make sure to subscribe to our Patreon and continue to support us. And with that, as usual, Jane Ward, live long and prosper, but men, die mad. Die mad, scrotes.
Die mad. And until next week.
Talk to you next week.